The dust swirled across the main street of Rock Springs, Wyoming, as Caleb Owens stood rigid at the stage coach stop, his 22-year-old frame taut with anticipation. The year was 1878, and today marked the arrival of his mail-order bride, a woman he knew only through 6 months of correspondence, a woman whose wisdom had captivated him through carefully penned letters that spoke of life's deeper meanings. "Reckon she'll be here soon," drawled the station master, glancing at his pocket watch. "Coach is running on time for once." Caleb nodded, adjusting his collar. His ranch was finally turning a profit after 3 years of backbreaking work. Now he needed a partner, someone with sense and experience to help build something lasting. Beauty hadn't been his priority when he'd placed the advertisement seeking a woman of substance and character. The distant rumble of wheels and the rhythmic clopping of hooves announced the stagecoach's arrival before it came into view. Dust billowed around the carriage as it lurched to a stop before him. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as the door swung open. The woman who emerged was not what he had expected. Silver hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and time had etched deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She moved carefully down the steps, one wrinkled hand gripping the rail, the other clutching a small carpet bag. She stood straight despite her years, her gaze direct as she surveyed the town, then finally rested her eyes on Caleb. "Miss Ruth Saunders?" Caleb asked, his voice barely audible above the commotion of the arriving coach. "Mrs.," she corrected gently. "Widowed these past 11 years." Caleb swallowed hard, aware of the station master's barely concealed snicker and the curious stares of townsfolk. She must have been at least 60, perhaps older, while her letters had implied a woman of middle years. "You seem surprised, Mr. Owens," she said, her voice carrying a quiet dignity. Caleb faltered, then found his voice. "I asked for wisdom, not beauty," he said, the words escaping before he could consider them. "And wisdom often comes with years." Something flickered in Ruth's eyes, relief perhaps, or appreciation for his quick recovery. "Then you shall not be disappointed," she replied with a small smile that transformed her face, revealing the young spirit behind the aged exterior. Caleb took her carpetbag and offered his arm. "Welcome to Rock Springs, Mrs. Saunders. My wagon is this way." As they walked, he felt the weight of stares following them. Whispers drifted on the wind, words like cradle robber and fortune hunter that made no sense given their respective ages, yet stung nonetheless. "Is your ranch far?" Ruth asked, seemingly oblivious to the attention they were drawing. "About an hour's ride," Caleb replied, helping her onto the wagon seat. "It's nothing grand, 200 acres, mostly suitable for cattle. The house is small but sound." As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, Ruth settled her skirts and looked straight ahead. "I've never been one for grand things, Mr. Owens. A sound home and honest work are what matter." The wagon pulled away from town, and Caleb felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over him. The woman beside him was not what he'd pictured during those long nights reading her thoughtful letters by lamplight, but there was something reassuring about her presence. "You can still change your mind," Ruth said suddenly, breaking the silence as the town receded behind them. "I would understand." Caleb glanced at her, noting the resolve in her profile despite the uncertainty in her voice. "Did you misrepresent yourself in your letters, Mrs. Saunders?" "No." "Did you lie about your character or your intentions?" "I did not." "Then I have received exactly what I asked for," Caleb said firmly. "A woman of substance who knows the value of hard work and can see beyond superficial concerns." Ruth's hands relaxed in her lap. "You are either very wise for your age, Mr. Owens, or very foolish." "I suspect we'll both discover which it is soon enough," he replied with a slight smile. The wagon rattled along the rutted trail, leaving the judgments of Rock Springs behind them. Ahead lay an uncertain future, a marriage of convenience between two strangers separated by decades of life experience. Neither could have predicted how deeply their lives would intertwine in the months to come. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly as they traveled, painting the Wyoming landscape in hues of gold and amber. Ruth remained quiet, her eyes taking in the vast emptiness punctuated by the occasional cluster of cottonwoods or rocky outcroppings. "It's beautiful country," she remarked at last. "Harsh but beautiful. That it is," Caleb agreed. "Takes a certain kind of person to see it, though. Most just see the hardship." "Like most things in life," Ruth mused, "beauty and hardship often walk hand in hand." Caleb shot her a curious look. There it was that wisdom that had drawn him to her letters. "You sound like you've known your share of both." "I've buried a husband and 2 sons," she said simply. "Lived through war and drought and more than one epidemic. But I've also seen newborn calves in spring meadows and sunsets that would make angels weep." They crested a gentle rise, and Caleb pointed ahead to where a modest cabin stood in a protected valley, a small barn and corral beside it. Several cattle grazed in the distance and smoke curled from the chimney. "You left someone at the house?" Ruth asked with surprise. "My neighbor's daughter comes by to help when I'm away," Caleb explained. "Rosie's only 14, but she's capable, probably has supper waiting." As they approached, Caleb felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness. His home was humble, a 2-room cabin with simple furnishings, though he'd added a lean-to room recently in anticipation of his bride's arrival. "It's not much," he said apologetically, as he drew the wagon to a stop. Ruth studied the cabin with appraising eyes. Solid construction, good positioning against the wind, a creek nearby for water. She nodded approvingly. "You've chosen well, Mr. Owens." Before Caleb could respond, the cabin door flew open, and a gangly girl with wheat-colored braids bounded out. "Mr. Owens, you're back," Rosie called, then stopped short when she saw Ruth. Her face registered surprise, quickly masked with politeness. "Madam," she greeted with a small curtsy. "Mrs. Saunders, this is Rosie Miller," Caleb introduced as he helped Ruth down from the wagon. "Rosie, this is Mrs. Ruth Saunders, his intended," Ruth finished for him with a gentle smile. "Though perhaps housekeeper might be easier for everyone to accept," Caleb frowned. "You didn't come all this way to be my housekeeper." Ruth patted his arm. "Labels matter less than truth, young man. We can sort out what to call our arrangement later." Rosie looked between them, clearly confused but too well-mannered to ask questions. "I made venison stew," she offered instead. "And there's fresh bread." "Perfect," Caleb said gratefully. "Would you mind helping Mrs. Saunders get settled while I tend to the horses? I've fixed up the side room for her." As Rosie led Ruth into the cabin, Caleb busied himself with the team, his mind whirling. The woman he'd brought home was nothing like he'd imagined, yet everything she'd promised in her letters. The town would talk they already had, but out here, 20 miles from prying eyes, did it really matter what anyone thought? By the time he entered the cabin, Ruth had removed her traveling clothes and stood by the stove in a simple gray dress, her silver hair neatly braided and wrapped around her head. She was stirring the stew while Rosie set the table. "Something smells wonderful," Caleb said, washing his hands in the basin by the door. "Rosie tells me you've been expanding the herd," Ruth remarked. 30 head now." 32, he confirmed. "Planning to reach 50 by next year if the winter's not too harsh." They sat down to supper, the 3 of them forming an unlikely tableau. Rosie chattered about local happenings, seemingly untroubled by Ruth's age once the initial surprise had worn off. Ruth asked thoughtful questions that revealed her knowledge of ranching knowledge gained through her own life on a farm in Missouri before her husband's death. When the meal was finished, Caleb drove Rosie home to her family's ranch 5 miles away. The silence in the wagon was heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Your Mrs. Saunders isn't what folks expected," Rosie finally ventured. "No," Caleb agreed. "She's not what I expected either. But you're not sending her back." "Would you send back something valuable just because its packaging was different than you anticipated?" Caleb asked. Rosie considered this. "I suppose not. But marriage is different than a package, Mr. Owens." "Is it? We all come wrapped in bodies that don't always reflect what's inside." Caleb sighed. "Mrs. Saunders has a keen mind and a lifetime of experience. That's worth more to me than a pretty face that doesn't know one end of a cow from the other." Rosie smiled. "Ma says you were always an odd one. Guess she was right." When Caleb returned to the cabin, he found Ruth sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, reading one of his books. She'd unpacked her few belongings in the side room and had hung curtains. She must have brought with her simple calico that instantly made the cabin feel more homelike. "You've been busy," he remarked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Idle hands invite the devil's work," she replied, setting the book aside. "We should talk about arrangements, Mr. Owens." "Caleb," he corrected, sitting across from her. "If we're to share this home, formality seems unnecessary." "Very well, Caleb." She folded her hands in her lap. "I recognize that our situation is unconventional. I want you to know that I expect nothing from you beyond shelter and basic courtesy. I'm here to help build your ranch, to cook and keep house, to offer what guidance my years might provide." "That's not what I advertised for," Caleb said quietly. "I sought a wife, not a servant." Ruth's eyes, a faded blue like denim washed too many times, met his directly. "You're a young man with his life ahead of him. I'm an old woman with most of mine behind me. Marriage between us would be a subject of ridicule." "I've never much cared for others' opinions," Caleb replied stubbornly. "But I won't force you into any arrangement that makes you uncomfortable. Perhaps we could agree to a trial period, live as partners, get to know one another, then decide." Ruth studied him for a long moment. "3 months," she said finally. "We'll revisit this conversation when winter sets in." "Agreed," Caleb said, extending his hand. Ruth's weathered fingers clasped his briefly, a business arrangement sealed with a handshake rather than a kiss. Yet as they said good night and retired to their separate rooms, Caleb found himself oddly content with the arrangement. Ruth Saunders might not be the bride he'd imagined, but something told him she was exactly the partner he needed. The first light of dawn had barely crested the eastern hills when Caleb woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. He dressed quickly and emerged from his room to find Ruth already fully clothed in a practical work dress, her silver hair pinned up under a cotton kerchief. "You're an early riser," he observed. "Farm habits die hard," she replied, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon before him as he sat at the table. "I've already fed the chickens and gathered eggs. Your milk cow is giving well, though she seems to have a touch of mastitis in one quarter." Caleb paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "How did you know?" "The milk has flecks in it. I've set it aside for the pigs and treated her with a warm compress. We'll need to watch her closely for a few days." Impressed despite himself, Caleb nodded. "I've been so busy with the cattle I hadn't noticed." "That's why 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1, Ruth said practically, sitting down with her own plate. "Now, tell me about your plans for today. I'd like to understand how this ranch operates." Over breakfast, Caleb outlined his daily routine and longer-term goals for the property. Ruth listened attentively, asking astute questions that revealed her understanding of cattle ranching. She'd grown up on a farm in Missouri and had helped her late husband run their modest cattle operation until his death. After Joseph died, I couldn't manage alone, she explained. My sons tried to help, but then the war came. Robert fell at Gettysburg. Thomas came home but was never the same. The consumption took him 3 years later. I'm sorry, Caleb said softly. Ruth shook her head. Life takes what it takes, young man. No use dwelling on sorrows that can't be changed. After breakfast, Caleb was surprised when Ruth insisted on accompanying him to check the herd. She changed into a split-riding skirt and mounted the gentle mare he kept for occasional use with surprising ease. Been a while since I've been astride, she admitted with a small smile. But like they say, some things you never forget. They rode out together, the morning dew still glistening on the prairie grass. Caleb found himself watching Ruth as much as the cattle. She sat the horse well, her back straight despite her years, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape with the awareness of someone who understood the land's temperamental nature. Your southern pasture would benefit from some clearing, she observed as they rode. Those scrub junipers are taking water the grass needs. I've been meaning to get to that, Caleb admitted. Always seems like something more pressing comes along. Winter work, Ruth suggested. When the cattle need less attention, we could burn it controlled in early spring before new growth. Caleb noted her use of we with a small spark of satisfaction. Perhaps she was already seeing herself as part of the ranch's future. Over the next few days, they fell into an easy rhythm. Ruth proved herself invaluable around the ranch, spotting problems before they developed and offering solutions born of experience. She took over the household management completely, bringing order to Caleb's bachelor existence. Meals appeared regularly, his clothes were washed and mended, and the cabin grew increasingly comfortable with small touches: a quilt here, a carefully arranged shelf of provisions there. A week after her arrival, Caleb returned from checking fence lines to find Ruth in the garden plot behind the cabin, her skirts tied up, digging in the soil with focused determination. "Bit late in the season to be planting, isn't it?" he asked, dismounting. "Not for winter greens," she replied without looking up. "Kale and certain cabbages will grow well into the cold months if properly tended, and I'm preparing ground for early spring planting. This soil needs work, too much clay. I've added composted manure from the barn." Caleb leaned on the fence, watching her methodical work. "You didn't have to do this." Ruth sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow with her forearm. "Every ranch needs a kitchen garden, saves money and improves health. Besides," she added with a wry smile, "idle hands invite the devil's work." Caleb finished with her, chuckling. "You've mentioned that before." Ruth pushed herself to her feet with a slight grimace that didn't escape Caleb's notice. "My knees remind me of my age, even when my mind forgets," she said ruefully. Without thinking, Caleb stepped forward and offered his arm for support. Ruth hesitated before accepting it, and he felt the slight tremor in her hand as she steadied herself. "Perhaps we should go into town tomorrow," Caleb suggested as they walked toward the cabin. "Replenish supplies, and," he added carefully, "let folks see that we're getting along just fine." Ruth gave him a knowing look. "Letting them see I haven't murdered you in your sleep, you mean?" Caleb grinned. "Something like that. Rumors have likely been swirling since our arrival." "Very well," Ruth agreed. "Though I warn you, my presence on your arm will only fuel more speculation." "Let them talk," Caleb said firmly. "What matters is what happens here between us." The next day they rode into Rock Springs together. Ruth wore her best dress, a modest navy blue affair with a lace collar, and had arranged her silver hair carefully beneath a matching bonnet. Caleb, too, had made an effort, wearing his Sunday shirt and brushing his unruly brown hair into submission. The stares began the moment they pulled the wagon onto Main Street. Women paused in their shopping to watch them pass. Men outside the saloon nudged one another. By the time they reached the general store, it seemed the entire town was aware of their presence. Inside, Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Mr. Owens, what a surprise to see you in town so soon." Her eyes darted to Ruth. "And Mrs. Saunders, isn't it? How are you finding our little community?" "What I've seen of it seems charming," Ruth replied politely. "Though I've been quite busy settling in at the ranch." "I'm sure you have," Mrs. Peterson said, her tone implying more than her words. "It must be quite an adjustment for someone of your experience." Caleb bristled, but Ruth merely smiled. "Indeed. Though ranching is ranching, whether in Missouri or Wyoming. The principles remain the same, even if the landscape differs." They moved through the store, selecting supplies: flour, coffee, sugar, and other staples. Ruth added thread and needles to their purchases, explaining quietly to Caleb that his shirts needed attention. As Caleb paid, the bell above the door jingled, and Sheriff Tom Cooper entered. He nodded to Caleb, his eyes lingering curiously on Ruth. "Owens," he greeted, "was hoping to run into you. Got reports of some cattle rustling over by Bitter Creek. Thought you should keep an eye out." "Appreciate the warning, Sheriff," Caleb replied. "Haven't noticed anything amiss, but I'll stay vigilant." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Ruth. "Madam," he acknowledged with a tip of his hat. "Sheriff," Ruth replied. "A pleasure to meet one of Caleb's neighbors. I'm Ruth Saunders." "Tom Cooper," he returned, then added with deliberate casualness, "You settling in all right at Owens' place? It's mighty isolated out there for a lady." "I find the isolation rather peaceful," Ruth answered smoothly. "And Caleb has been a perfect gentleman." Something in her tone, a subtle emphasis on gentleman, made the sheriff's eyebrows rise slightly. "Glad to hear it," he said after a moment. "Still, if you ever need anything, I know where to find you," Ruth finished with a polite smile. "Thank you, Sheriff." As they left the store, Caleb helped Ruth into the wagon, acutely aware of the eyes watching from windows and doorways along the street. "That should give them something to chew on," Ruth murmured as he climbed up beside her. "Was that your intention?" Caleb asked, surprised. "People will talk regardless," Ruth replied pragmatically. "Better to give them something specific to discuss than leave them to their imaginations." Her eyes twinkled mischievously. "By tonight, half the town will be convinced we're scandalously in love, and the other half will believe I'm holding you hostage somehow." Caleb laughed out loud, the tension of the visit dissolving. "And which is it, Mrs. Saunders?" he teased as he snapped the reins. "Neither, Mr. Owens," she returned serenely. "We're simply two practical people making the best of an unexpected situation." Yet as they rode home, Caleb found himself wondering if practicality was all that bound them. In just a week, Ruth had become essential to his daily life, not just for her contributions to the ranch, but for her companionship. Their evenings spent reading by the fire or discussing plans for the property had become the part of the day he most looked forward to. Ruth had awakened something in him that had been dormant, a desire for connection that went beyond physical attraction. He found himself drawn to her mind, her resilience, her quiet strength. It was a different kind of attraction than he'd ever experienced, but no less powerful for its uniqueness. As the wagon rolled toward home, Caleb stole a glance at Ruth's profile against the setting sun and wondered if she ever had similar thoughts about him, or if he was merely a means to security in her twilight years. The question lingered, unasked, as they returned to the ranch and resumed their careful dance of coexistence, two strangers becoming something more with each passing day. The weeks slipped by, summer heat giving way to the first crisp hints of autumn. September brought golden light that slanted low across the prairie and turned the distant mountains to purple silhouettes each evening. Ruth's garden flourished under her careful attention, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented their meals, while Caleb focused on preparing the ranch for the coming winter. They had settled into a comfortable routine, each finding satisfaction in their respective responsibilities while learning to work together on shared tasks. Caleb found Ruth to be an invaluable partner, her experience often compensating for his youthful energy. She never complained, even when he knew her aging body must protest the long days of physical labor. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Ruth broke their companionable silence. "My husband would have liked you," she said unexpectedly. Caleb turned to her, surprised. Ruth rarely spoke of her past, and mentions of her late husband were even more uncommon. "What was he like?" Caleb asked carefully. Ruth's gaze remained on the horizon, but a soft smile played at her lips. "Joseph was steady, reliable, not a man of many words, but the ones he spoke carried weight." She glanced at Caleb. "Rather like you in that respect." "How did you meet?" "At a church social when I was 16. He was 21 and already had his own farm, a small place, but it was his. He asked me to dance 3 times that night." Ruth's eyes grew distant with memory. "We were married 6 months later. Everyone said it wouldn't last. I was too headstrong, he was too quiet. But we balanced each other. 41 years we had together." "You must miss him terribly," Caleb said softly. "Every day," Ruth acknowledged. "But life continues for those left behind. We either move forward or petrify in our grief." She turned to face him fully. "Which is why I answered your advertisement, Caleb. Not because I expect to replace what I've lost, but because I refuse to waste whatever years remain to me." Caleb nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling. After my parents died, fever took them both when I was 17. I could have stayed in Pennsylvania, working someone else's land. But something in me needed to build something of my own." "And you have," Ruth said, gesturing to the ranch spread before them. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished here." "It's better with you here," Caleb said before he could think better of it. "The ranch, I mean. It runs smoother. Makes more sense somehow." Ruth studied him for a long moment. "Our trial period is nearly over," she said quietly. "We should discuss what happens next." Caleb's heart quickened. The 3 months they'd agreed upon had indeed nearly elapsed, though he'd almost forgotten their arrangement's provisional nature. Ruth had become such a natural part of his life that he couldn't imagine the ranch or his days without her. "What do you want to happen next?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "I've given this considerable thought," she began carefully. "I believe our arrangement has been beneficial for both of us. You've provided me security and purpose. I've contributed experience and household management." "That sounds like a business assessment," Caleb observed, a hint of disappointment coloring his tone. "Because that's what we agreed to," Ruth reminded him gently. "A practical partnership. And if I want more than that—" The words escaped before Caleb could censor them. Ruth's expression softened. "Caleb, I'm old enough to be your grandmother. Whatever you think you feel, don't tell me what I feel," he interrupted, uncharacteristic intensity in his voice. "I know my own mind, Ruth, and my own heart." "Do you?" she challenged. "Or are you confusing gratitude and companionship for deeper emotions?" Caleb stood, too restless to remain seated. "I don't know how to convince you that what I feel is real. But I know that when I think about this ranch's future, I can't picture it without you beside me. Not just as my housekeeper or partner, but as my wife." Ruth's eyes glistened in the fading light. "You deserve someone who can share your life fully, Caleb. Someone who can give you children, who will be with you for decades to come." "If I wanted those things above all else, I would have sought them," Caleb replied firmly. What I need is a woman of substance, of character, of wisdom." He knelt before her chair, taking her weathered hands in his. "I asked for wisdom, not beauty, Ruth, and I found both in you." A single tear traced down Ruth's cheek. "You're a remarkable young man, Caleb Owens, either uncommonly wise or uncommonly foolish." "Perhaps both," he admitted with a small smile. "Will you marry me, Ruth, properly before God and whatever neighbors are brave enough to attend?" Ruth was silent for so long that Caleb began to fear he'd overstepped. Then, finally, she squeezed his hands. "Yes," she whispered, "though heaven knows what people will say." "Let them talk," Caleb said, joy bubbling through him. "We know the truth of what we're building here." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Rock Springs. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of neighbors who had come to accept their unusual relationship. Rosie Miller served as Ruth's attendant, beaming with approval as the elderly bride and her young groom exchanged vows. The wedding supper afterward, held at their ranch, was a surprisingly joyful affair. Even Sheriff Cooper offered his congratulations, albeit with a bemused expression that suggested he still didn't quite understand their union. As the guests departed and twilight settled over the ranch, Caleb and Ruth stood on their porch, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. "Well, Mrs. Owens," Caleb said, trying the name out loud for the first time, "it seems we've given Rock Springs something to talk about for at least the next year." Ruth chuckled. "Longer than that, I suspect." She gazed out at the land they now officially shared. "I never expected to be a bride again, especially not at my age." "Are you happy?" Caleb asked, suddenly anxious. Ruth turned to him, her eyes clear and direct. "Happiness is a fleeting emotion, Caleb. What matters more is contentment, purpose, belonging." She reached for his hand. "And yes, in all those ways that truly matter, I am very happy indeed." That night, as they prepared for bed, there was a new awareness between them, an acknowledgement that their relationship had fundamentally changed. They had agreed in private conversations before the wedding that theirs would be a marriage of companionship rather than physical passion. Caleb had assured Ruth that he understood and accepted these terms, valuing their connection too much to risk it over physical desires. Yet as Ruth emerged from her room in a modest nightgown, her silver hair falling in a long braid down her back, Caleb was struck by how beautiful she was to him, not with the conventional beauty of youth, but with the deeper beauty of a life fully lived, of wisdom earned through joy and sorrow alike. "Good night, husband," Ruth said softly, pausing by his door. "Good night, wife," Caleb replied, resisting the urge to reach for her. As winter descended on the Wyoming prairie, bringing snow that blanketed the ranch in pristine white, Caleb and Ruth settled into married life. Their days were filled with the work necessary to keep the cattle fed and healthy through the cold months. Their evenings spent in the warm cabin, reading aloud to one another, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of true companionship. Christmas approached, bringing with it a blizzard that kept them housebound for 3 days. Ruth used the time to teach Caleb to make his mother's Christmas cookies, from a recipe she'd coaxed from his memories. They sat before the fire, the cabin fragrant with cinnamon and ginger, as Caleb spoke more freely than ever before about his childhood and the parents he still missed. "They would have liked you," he told Ruth, echoing her earlier words about her husband. "Especially my father. He always said that good sense was worth more than gold." Ruth smiled, her needles clicking as she worked on the sweater she was knitting him for Christmas. And your mother, would she have approved of her son marrying a woman old enough to be his grandmother? Caleb considered this. She would have been surprised, he admitted. But she judged people by their actions, not their circumstances. Once she saw how you are with me, how we are together, she would have understood. On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts: the sweater from Ruth, a handcrafted rocking chair from Caleb that he'd been secretly building in the barn. Ruth ran her hands over the smooth wood, tears filling her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I haven't had a proper rocking chair since Missouri." "Every ranch wife needs one," Caleb said, pleased by her reaction. "For when grandchildren visit," he added with a teasing smile. Ruth laughed. "I think we'll have to settle for neighborhood children, unless you're planning on adopting." The idea caught Caleb by surprise, but not unpleasantly so. "Would you want that?" he asked carefully. "To raise a child together?" Ruth's expression grew thoughtful. "I hadn't considered it possible," she admitted, "at my age, but there are always children who need homes." "Something to think about," Caleb suggested, not pushing the idea but letting it settle between them like a seed that might someday take root. January brought the coldest days of winter and an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Cooper arrived one bitter afternoon, his horse steaming in the frigid air. "Trouble?" Caleb asked, meeting him in the yard. "Maybe," Cooper replied grimly. "Stagecoach was robbed yesterday about 15 miles east. Driver wounded. Passengers unharmed but relieved of their valuables." "Terrible," Caleb said, gesturing for the sheriff to follow him into the barn where they could speak out of the wind. "But what brings you all the way out here?" "Two men," Cooper explained, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. "Descriptions match a pair that's been working their way through Wyoming and Montana. Thought you should know they might be in the area." "I appreciate the warning," Caleb said. "We'll keep the doors locked and the rifle loaded." Cooper nodded. "Good, also." He hesitated. "Wanted to check on Mrs. Owens, make sure everything's all right." Caleb stiffened slightly. "Ruth is fine, we both are." "Don't get your back up, Owens," Cooper said, raising a placating hand. "Just doing my job." Your marriage raised eyebrows. "Can't blame folks for being concerned." "Concerned that an old woman might be taking advantage of a young man?" Caleb asked sardonically. "Or concerned that a young man might be mistreating an old woman?" "Both, if you want the truth," Cooper admitted. "Though most are coming around to the idea that you two might actually suit each other, odd as it seems." Before Caleb could respond, Ruth appeared at the barn door, wrapped in a heavy shawl. "Sheriff Cooper," she greeted. "You must be half frozen. Come inside for coffee and something hot to eat." Cooper glanced between them, then nodded. "Much obliged, Mrs. Owens. Just for a few minutes before I head back." Inside the warm cabin, Ruth served coffee and stew with fresh bread. The sheriff's eyes took in the orderly home, lingering on the small touches that spoke of comfort and care: the quilt draped over Caleb's chair, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the bookshelves Caleb had built to hold Ruth's small collection of beloved volumes. "You've made quite a home here," Cooper observed, addressing Ruth. "We have," she agreed, emphasizing the "we" slightly. "Though much of it was Caleb's work before I arrived. Still," Cooper persisted, "it's different now, more lived in," Caleb supplied. "A house becomes a home when it holds more than just necessities." Cooper nodded slowly, something in his expression shifting. "Well," he said finally, setting down his empty cup, "I should get back before dark. Thank you for the hospitality." At the door he paused. "Keep an eye out for those robbers." Two men, one tall and thin with a scar on his chin, one shorter with a red beard. "They're armed and desperate." "We'll be careful," Caleb assured him. After the sheriff had gone, Ruth turned to Caleb with a small smile. I believe we've just been officially accepted as a respectable married couple." "About time," Caleb replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Only took 3 months of marriage and half the winter." Ruth leaned against him briefly, a gesture of affection that had become more natural between them. Progress comes slowly in small communities, but it comes. The robbers the sheriff had warned them about didn't materialize, and winter gradually released its grip on the land. By early March, the first hints of green began to appear in sheltered spots, though snow still covered much of the range. With spring approaching, Caleb and Ruth turned their attention to preparations for calving season. The herd had weathered the winter well, and Caleb anticipated a good crop of calves. Ruth's garden plans had expanded, with ambitious designs for both vegetables and a small flower bed near the porch to brighten things up, as she put it. One evening, as Ruth worked on mending and Caleb whittled a replacement handle for a broken tool, a knock at the door startled them both. Visitors were rare, especially after dark. Caleb set aside his work and reached for the rifle kept by the door. "Who's there?" he called. "Please," came a woman's voice, young and clearly distressed. "Please help us." Caleb exchanged a glance with Ruth, who nodded. He opened the door cautiously to find a young woman, probably no more than 20, standing on their porch. Her clothes were travel-worn, her face tear-streaked. Behind her, a man sat slumped in a wagon, one arm bound in a bloody bandage. "My husband's been shot," the woman said frantically. "We were headed to his brother's place near Bitter Creek, but he's getting worse. Yours was the first house we've seen in miles." "Bring him in," Ruth said immediately, already clearing space near the fire. Caleb helped the man. "Miss, come with me, we'll need hot water and clean cloths." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. The wounded man, who introduced himself as Daniel Carter, when he was lucid enough to speak, had been shot in the arm during an encounter with the very robbers Sheriff Cooper had warned them about. The bullet had passed through the flesh of his upper arm, but the wound was infected and Daniel was feverish. Ruth took charge with calm efficiency, cleaning the wound thoroughly despite Daniel's pained protests. She applied a poultice of herbs she dried for medicinal purposes, and rebandaged the arm with clean strips of cotton. "He needs rest and constant care for at least a few days," Ruth told the young woman Sarah Carter as Daniel finally fell into an exhausted sleep on the pallet they'd made for him near the fire. "The infection is significant. Moving him now would risk his life." "We can't impose," Sarah began weakly, though her eyes revealed her relief. "Nonsense," Ruth said firmly. "Where else would you go? You'll stay until he's well enough to travel safely." Caleb nodded his agreement. "I'll take care of your horses and bring in your things. You can have our spare room. Ruth can stay with me for now." If Sarah thought this arrangement odd between a young husband and his elderly wife, she gave no sign of it. She merely thanked them with tears in her eyes. Later that night, as Ruth prepared for bed in Caleb's room for the first time, an awkward awareness hung between them. "I can sleep in the chair," Caleb offered, gesturing to the armchair by the window. Ruth shook her head. "Don't be foolish. The bed is large enough for both of us, and you need proper rest. You have cattle to tend in the morning." They settled under the covers with careful space between them, both lying rigid on their backs. "This is ridiculous," Ruth said after a few minutes of tense silence. "We're behaving like nervous children." Caleb chuckled, the tension broken. "True enough. Though I must admit, I never expected to have you in my bed under these circumstances." In the darkness, he sensed rather than saw Ruth smile. "Life rarely follows our expectations, Caleb. That's one lesson age teaches with absolute certainty." They fell into a more comfortable silence, and eventually, sleep claimed them both. Sometime in the night, Caleb woke briefly to find that they had moved closer in sleep, Ruth's head resting against his shoulder. Rather than pulling away, he simply closed his eyes again, a sense of rightness settling over him. The Carters stayed for 10 days, during which time Daniel's condition steadily improved under Ruth's care. Sarah proved herself helpful around the house, eager to earn their hospitality by assisting with chores. In the evenings, the four of them would sit by the fire, sharing stories and finding unexpected common ground despite their different backgrounds. On their final evening, as they shared a farewell supper, Sarah raised her glass in a toast. "To the kindest people we've ever had the fortune to meet," she said, her eyes bright with sincere gratitude. "You saved Daniel's life, and you asked for nothing in return." "Anyone would have done the same," Ruth demurred. "No," Daniel said firmly, his arm now healing cleanly in a proper sling. "Not anyone. Most would have sent us on our way with perhaps a meal and basic supplies. You took us in, cared for us, treated us like family." He looked between Caleb and Ruth with genuine curiosity. "May I ask how long you've been married?" "Just since October," Caleb answered. "Really?" Sarah looked surprised. "You seem like you've been together much longer, the way you work together, anticipate each other's needs." Ruth smiled. "Some partnerships form quickly when they're right. Like us," Daniel said, reaching for Sarah's hand. "We knew within 2 weeks of meeting that we belonged together." "Your brother will be worried about you," Ruth said, changing the subject slightly. "But you're welcome to return anytime. Perhaps when you're fully healed." The next morning, as the Carters prepared to depart, Sarah took Ruth aside while the men loaded the wagon. "I hope you don't mind my saying this," she began hesitantly, "but I think what you and Caleb have is beautiful. At first, I admit I was surprised by your age difference, but watching you together these past days." She smiled. "It's clear how much he values your wisdom and how much you cherish his strength. Not all love looks the same, does it?" Ruth's expression softened. "No, it doesn't. Though I sometimes still wonder if I'm being selfish, tying a young man to an old woman." "Selfish?" Sarah looked genuinely confused. "From what I've seen, you both get exactly what you need from each other. What could be more right than that?" After the Carters had gone, disappearing down the road toward Bitter Creek with promises to visit in the summer, the ranch seemed unusually quiet. Caleb and Ruth moved through their daily routines, but something had shifted between them during their 10 days of shared sleeping quarters. That evening, as Ruth prepared to return to her own room, Caleb spoke up from his place by the fire. "You don't have to go," he said softly. Ruth paused, her back to him. "Caleb, I'm not suggesting anything improper," he clarified quickly. I've grown accustomed to your presence. To falling asleep listening to your breathing, to waking with you beside me." Ruth turned to face him, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. "What are you asking for, exactly?" Caleb stood, crossing to where she stood. "I'm asking for my wife to share my bed in whatever capacity feels right to her. I'm asking for the comfort of your presence through the night." He took her hands gently. "Nothing more than you wish to give." Ruth studied his face for a long moment. "You surprise me constantly, Caleb Owens," she said finally. "Most men your age." "I'm not most men," he interrupted. "And you're not most women. We've never been a conventional couple, Ruth. Why start now?" A slow smile spread across her face. "Why indeed?" She squeezed his hands. "Very well. Though I warn you, I sometimes snore," Caleb laughed. "I'm aware. You've been sleeping beside me for 10 days. That night, as they lay together in what was now truly their shared bed, the last barriers between them seemed to dissolve. They spoke quietly in the darkness about hopes and fears, about the ranch's future, about the surprising turn their lives had taken since Ruth had stepped down from the stagecoach 6 months earlier. I never expected to find this kind of partnership again, Ruth confessed. After Joseph died, I resigned myself to living out my days alone. Coming here was a desperate gamble, a final attempt to find purpose before age rendered me completely dependent on others' charity. And now, Caleb asked, his voice low in the darkness. Ruth was silent for a moment. Now I find myself hoping for more years than I probably have left, she admitted. Not out of fear of death, but because I've found something worth living for again. Caleb reached for her hand beneath the covers, interlacing their fingers. We have today, he said simply. And with luck, many tomorrows. I don't ask for more than that. The following months brought the full bloom of spring and then the heat of summer. The ranch prospered under their joint management. The calving season had been successful, with only 2 losses among 30 births. Ruth's garden flourished, providing abundant vegetables and, as promised, a riot of colorful flowers that brightened the approach to the cabin. Their unconventional marriage had gradually become accepted in Rock Springs. Visitors to the ranch, initially drawn by curiosity, found themselves disarmed by the obvious harmony between the young rancher and his elderly wife. Ruth's wisdom and Caleb's energy complemented each other in ways that became evident to even the most skeptical observers. In July, they hosted a small gathering to celebrate their first harvest of early vegetables. The Millers came, including young Rosie, who had blossomed into a confident 15-year-old under Ruth's occasional mentoring. Sheriff Cooper attended with his sister, recently arrived from back east. Even the Carters made the journey from Bitter Creek, Daniel now fully recovered and Sarah visibly expecting their first child. As Caleb watched Ruth moving among their guests, serving food and engaging everyone with her natural warmth, he felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The decision that many had questioned, that he himself had sometimes doubted in those first uncertain days, had proven to be the wisest choice of his life. Later, as the evening cooled and the guests departed, Caleb found Ruth sitting on the porch in her rocking chair, gazing out at the land that had become their shared domain. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her. Ruth smiled, continuing her gentle rocking. "I was just thinking about time," she said. "How differently it moves at different stages of life. When I was your age, a year seemed so long. Now they fly past like tumbleweeds in a high wind." "Regrets?" Caleb asked gently. "Not about us," Ruth assured him quickly. "Never that. Just wishing, perhaps selfishly, that we might have had more years together, that I could have known you in my prime." Caleb reached over to take her hand, his thumb tracing the prominent veins and age spots that marked her skin. "You are in your prime, Ruth Owens. Different from youth, certainly, but no less valuable, perhaps more so." Ruth's eyes glistened in the fading light. "How did I find such a wise young man?" "You answered an advertisement," Caleb reminded her with a grin. "And arrived elderly and gray to a young cowboy who asked for wisdom, not beauty. Then proceeded to give him both." Ruth laughed, the sound still youthful despite her years. "You silver-tongued charmer." They sat in comfortable silence as twilight deepened into night, the stars emerging one by one above their ranch. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more moments both ordinary and precious. But for now, this moment was enough. 2 unlikely souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed, despite all expectations. As summer gave way to fall, marking a full year since Ruth's arrival at the ranch, life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and constantly renewed. The cattle herd had grown to 47, exceeding Caleb's target. Ruth's garden had produced bountifully, and jars of preserved vegetables now lined the shelves she'd instructed Caleb to build in the cool storage area beneath the cabin. One crisp October morning, as they sat at breakfast planning the day ahead, a knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Caleb opened it to find Rosie Miller standing on their porch, her young face unusually serious. "Mr. Owens," she began formally, then relaxed slightly. "Caleb, my pa sent me to fetch you and Mrs. Owens. There's a situation in town you should know about." "What kind of situation?" Ruth asked, joining them at the door. Rosie hesitated. "A man arrived on yesterday's stage. He's asking about you, Mrs. Owens. Says he's your nephew." Ruth's face paled slightly. "Richard," she whispered. "Richard is here." Caleb looked at her with concern. "You have a nephew, my brother William's son," Ruth confirmed, her voice strained. "We haven't spoken in many years, not since after Thomas died." "Pa said he seems mighty determined to see you," Rosie added. "He's staying at the hotel in town. Asked a lot of questions about your situation here." Caleb and Ruth exchanged a look loaded with unspoken concerns. "Thank your father for the warning," Caleb told Rosie. "Tell him we'll ride into town this afternoon." After Rosie had gone, Ruth sank into her rocking chair, her usual composure visibly shaken. "I never expected him to find me here," she said quietly. "We didn't part on good terms." "What happened?" Caleb asked, kneeling beside her chair. Ruth's hands twisted in her lap. "After Thomas died, I was alone. The farm was too much for me to manage by myself. Richard offered to take me, and he and his wife had a large house in St. Louis, but there were conditions." Her mouth tightened. "I would deed the farm to him. Live in their back bedroom. Help with their children and household while they managed my affairs." "You refused," Caleb guessed. "I did," Ruth confirmed. "I sold the farm myself instead and used the money to live independently. Richard was angry. Said I was being foolish and stubborn, that at my age I needed protection." A flash of the old spirit returned to her eyes. "I told him I'd rather die alone than live as someone's unpaid servant. And now he's here," Caleb mused, his protective instincts rising. "Why, after all this time?" "I can think of only one reason," Ruth said grimly. "He must have learned about our marriage somehow. Probably thinks you're taking advantage of me, or more specifically, of whatever funds I might still have from the farm sale." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then we'll set him straight together." They rode into Rock Springs that afternoon, Ruth sitting tall in the saddle despite the anxiety Caleb could sense in her rigid posture. At the hotel, they were directed to the dining room, where a well-dressed man in his 40s sat alone at a corner table. "Aunt Ruth," he said, rising as they approached. His gaze moved critically over her plain clothing and then to Caleb with barely concealed suspicion. "You're looking well, Richard," Ruth acknowledged coolly. "This is my husband, Caleb Owens. Caleb, my nephew, Richard Barnes." The men shook hands with palpable tension. Richard's grip was deliberately firm, his eyes assessing as he took in Caleb's lean, muscular frame and sun-weathered face. "Quite a surprise to learn my elderly aunt had remarried," Richard said as they sat. "To a man young enough to be her grandson, no less. News travels surprisingly fast," Ruth observed. "Particularly considering I haven't corresponded with anyone from Missouri in years." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah Carter wrote to her cousin in St. Louis, who happened to mention to an acquaintance that she'd stayed with the most unusual couple in Wyoming territory, a young rancher and his elderly wife who had nursed her husband back to health. The description was distinctive. The Carters are good friends," Caleb said evenly. "They've visited us twice since Daniel recovered." "How fortunate for them that you were so charitable," Richard replied. His attention returned to Ruth. "Aunt Ruth, I've come because I'm concerned. Living out here so far from proper civilization at your age, it isn't appropriate." Ruth's spine straightened. I wasn't aware I needed your approval for my living arrangements, Richard. I've been making my own decisions for quite some time now. And look where that's led you, Richard countered, his voice dropping to avoid being overheard by the few other diners. Married to a man less than half your age, living in what I'm told is little more than a cabin in the middle of nowhere. People are talking, Aunt Ruth. It reflects poorly on our family name. Our family name, Ruth repeated with a raised eyebrow. You never seemed overly concerned about that when you tried to force me into your back bedroom and take control of my property. Richard flushed. That was for your own protection. As this is, I've come to bring you back to St. Louis, where you can live out your remaining years with dignity. Caleb, who had been controlling his rising anger, finally spoke. Mr. Barnes, your aunt doesn't need rescuing. She's my wife, my partner in every sense. Our home may be simple by St. Louis standards, but it's ours. Ruth has more dignity chopping vegetables in our garden than she ever would hiding away in your spare room. You have no right, Richard began hotly. I have every right, Caleb interrupted firmly. As Ruth's husband and as someone who values her independence and wisdom. Which is more than I can say for you. Ruth placed a calming hand on Caleb's arm. Richard, she said, her voice steady, I appreciate that you traveled all this way out of what you believe is concern for my welfare, but I am exactly where I choose to be, with the man I choose to be with. My life here has purpose and joy. I need nothing more. Richard looked between them, his expression calculating. And what happens when you die, Aunt Ruth? Have you considered that? Has your young husband encouraged you to make a will in his favor? That's enough, Caleb said sharply, rising from his chair. You've insulted both me and your aunt with these insinuations. Whatever Ruth chooses to do with her property is her business, not mine and certainly not yours. We're leaving, Richard, Ruth said, also standing. You're welcome to visit our ranch if you wish to see for yourself how we live. Otherwise, I suggest you take the next stage back east. There's nothing for you to rescue here. They left Richard sitting open-mouthed in the dining room. Outside, Caleb helped Ruth onto her horse with hands that still trembled slightly from suppressed anger. I'm sorry, he said quietly as they rode out of town. I shouldn't have lost my temper. You defended me admirably, Ruth replied, a small smile playing at her lips. Though I'm perfectly capable of handling Richard myself. I know you are, Caleb assured her, but he insulted our marriage, suggested I married you for money, of all the ridiculous things. Ruth's smile faded. It's not so ridiculous from his perspective, Caleb. A young man marrying an elderly woman, most would assume there must be some financial incentive. Most don't know us, Caleb said firmly, and I don't care what they think. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Ruth seemed unusually quiet and thoughtful. Caleb gave her space, sensing she was processing the unexpected confrontation with her nephew. It wasn't until they had extinguished the lamp and lay side by side in the darkness that she finally spoke. Caleb, she began hesitantly, Richard's visit has made me realize we need to discuss certain matters we've avoided. What matters? Caleb asked, turning on his side to face her shadowed profile. Ruth sighed. Practical ones. Richard was right about one thing. I should have a will. Not for his benefit, but for yours. This ranch is as much mine now as yours through our shared labor, if nothing else. If something happened to me, Ruth, Caleb started to protest. No, let me finish, she insisted gently. I'm 82 years old, Caleb. We both know I won't be here to see this ranch in its prime. When I go, I want everything I have, which isn't much beyond some savings and my personal belongings, to pass to you without question or complication. Caleb was silent for a long moment, the reality of their situation settling heavily between them. It was a truth they'd acknowledged only obliquely until now that their time together was inherently limited by the natural course of life. "All right," he finally conceded. "We'll speak to the lawyer in town next time we visit, but I want you to do something else for me." "What's that?" Ruth asked. "I want you to make a list of all the things you'd still like to do or see, places you've never been, experiences you've missed. Then I want us to start working through that list one by one for however many years we have." Ruth's hand found his in the darkness. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Most women my age are preparing for the end, not making lists of new beginnings." "You're not most women," Caleb reminded her, "and I refuse to spend whatever time we have together waiting for it to end. Promise me, Ruth." "I promise," she said after a moment. "Though I warn you, I've always wanted to see the ocean." Caleb chuckled. "Then we'd better start planning a journey to California." Richard appeared at their ranch the next morning, looking somewhat chastened. He had clearly expected to find Ruth living in primitive conditions, perhaps even under some form of duress. Instead, he was greeted by a well-maintained property, a comfortable if modest home, and the unmistakable evidence of a harmonious partnership. Ruth showed him around with quiet pride while Caleb worked nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but giving them space to talk privately. By the time the tour concluded on the front porch, Richard's demeanor had noticeably shifted. "You've built something remarkable here," he admitted reluctantly to Caleb as Ruth went inside to prepare lunch. "It's not what I expected." "Few things in life are," Caleb replied evenly. "Especially when we make assumptions based on conventional thinking." Richard studied him thoughtfully. "You genuinely care for her." "I love her," Caleb corrected simply. "Her age is incidental to who she is." Richard shook his head in lingering disbelief. "I still don't entirely understand it, but I can see she's content here, with you." "More than content," Ruth said, rejoining them on the porch. "I'm fulfilled, Richard, more so than I've been since your uncle died." Richard had the grace to look somewhat ashamed. "I was wrong to assume." "What I assumed, I apologize." "Apology accepted," Ruth said graciously. "Now, will you stay for lunch, or are you eager to return to St. Louis?" "Actually," Richard said, seeming to come to a decision, "I've been thinking about staying in Rock Springs a few days longer. Getting to know you both better if you're amenable. Perhaps even helping with some ranch work, though I warn you I'm not much use with cattle." Caleb and Ruth exchanged surprised glances. "You're welcome to stay with us," Caleb offered, extending an olive branch. "We have a spare room." Richard ended up staying for a week, gradually shedding his city airs and even developing a tentative rapport with Caleb. By the time he departed for Missouri, a fragile reconciliation had been established between aunt and nephew. Richard promised to write regularly and extended an invitation for them to visit St. Louis someday, an invitation Ruth accepted with the private caveat to Caleb that it would be part of their journey to see the ocean. The reunion with her estranged family, unexpected as it had been, seemed to free something in Ruth. In the weeks that followed, she embraced life on the ranch with renewed vigor, working alongside Caleb as they prepared for another Wyoming winter. True to her promise, she began a list of experiences she wanted to share with him, some as ambitious as seeing the Pacific Ocean, others as simple as learning to make the sourdough bread her grandmother had baked. As winter settled over the land once more, bringing with it the peaceful isolation of snow-covered fields and long evenings by the fire, Caleb and Ruth found their bond deepening in ways neither had anticipated when they'd first met 14 months earlier. The practical partnership had evolved into something profound, a love that transcended conventional understanding, enriched by their differences rather than diminished by them. One snowy evening in December, as they sat before the fire engaged in their usual companionable activities, Ruth knitting, Caleb reading aloud from a book of poetry she'd introduced him to, Ruth set aside her work with an unusually serious expression. "I've been thinking," she began, "about what you said that day when I first arrived." Caleb looked up from the book. "What did I say? That you asked for wisdom, not beauty?" A small smile played at her lips. "It was a kind thing to say to an old woman stepping down from a stagecoach, especially when you were clearly expecting someone different." "It was the truth," Caleb said simply. "Though I've come to realize I received both anyway." Ruth's eyes softened. "You still surprise me, Caleb Owens. Just when I think I understand the limits of your capacity for acceptance, you expand them again." "There are no limits to love," Caleb replied, setting the book aside and moving to kneel beside her chair. "Not real love. It doesn't recognize barriers of age or circumstance. It simply is." Ruth reached out to touch his face gently, her weathered fingers tracing the contours of his cheek with a tenderness that made his heart ache. "I never expected to love again at my age," she confessed quietly. "I thought that part of my life was finished." "You've given me a gift beyond price, Caleb, a second chance at happiness when I'd resigned myself to mere contentment." Caleb turned his face to press a kiss into her palm. "The gift has been mine, Ruth. You've taught me what truly matters in this life. Not fleeting beauty or passion, but understanding, respect, shared purpose." He smiled up at her. "Though I won't deny there's beauty in you that takes my breath away, even now." Ruth laughed softly, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Charmer." They sat together in peaceful silence as the fire crackled and snow fell gently outside, wrapping their ranch in a blanket of pristine white. The path that had brought them together had been unconventional: a young cowboy seeking wisdom, an elderly bride arriving with gray hair and lined face, but the destination had proven worth every raised eyebrow and whispered comment. In the spring, true to Caleb's promise, they would begin their journey to the ocean, taking the stagecoach to the newly completed railroad that would carry them west to California. Ruth's list of experiences would gradually be fulfilled, one by one, in the time they had together. And though both knew that time was finite, they had learned the most valuable lesson of all: that a life well lived is measured not in years, but in moments of genuine connection, in purpose fulfilled, in love freely given and gratefully received. As the years passed, the ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Ruth's garden expanded to include an orchard of apple and cherry trees that Caleb planted for her as a surprise on their second anniversary. Their home grew as well, with additions that made the original cabin the heart of a comfortable ranch house. Neighbors who had once gossiped about the unusual couple gradually came to see them as a fixture of the community, their age difference becoming simply another fact rather than a defining characteristic. Young couples sought their advice on ranching and on marriage, drawn by the evident harmony between the elderly woman and her much younger husband. Time was not always kind. Ruth's arthritis worsened, making some days difficult. Caleb took on more of the physical labor, but Ruth's mind remained sharp as ever, her counsel guiding their decisions about the ranch's management. They traveled when they could to California to see the Pacific Ocean, to St. Louis to visit Richard and his family, to Colorado to soak in the healing hot springs that temporarily eased Ruth's discomfort. 5 years after their wedding, they took in a 10-year-old orphaned boy named Michael, whose parents had died in a flash flood. Under their joint guardianship, he flourished, learning ranching from Caleb and life's deeper wisdom from Ruth. He became the child neither had expected to have a legacy that would extend beyond their time together. In the 7th spring of their marriage, as the wildflowers bloomed across the prairie in a riot of color, Ruth fell ill. The doctor from Rock Springs could offer little beyond comfort measures, and the grim assessment that at 89, Ruth's body was simply wearing out. Caleb refused to leave her side, moving their bed near the window so Ruth could see her beloved garden. Michael, now 15 and almost as tall as Caleb, helped run the ranch during the day and sat with Ruth in the evenings, reading to her from her favorite books. On a perfect May morning, with sunlight streaming through the window and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of lilacs Ruth had planted years earlier, she reached for Caleb's hand. "No regrets," she whispered, her voice weak but her eyes still bright with the intelligence and warmth that had captured his heart. "Promise me, Caleb." "I promise," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "How could I regret the best decision I ever made?" Ruth smiled, the expression transforming her face just as it had that first day at the stagecoach stop. "I asked for security," she said softly, "and found love instead. We've both been fortunate beyond measure." Later that afternoon, with Caleb holding one hand and Michael the other, Ruth Saunders Owens slipped peacefully away. She was buried on the ranch, on a hillside overlooking the land they had tended together, beneath a granite marker that read simply, "Ruth Owens, beloved wife and mother who brought wisdom and beauty in equal measure." Caleb continued to run the ranch with Michael's help, honoring Ruth's memory by implementing the plans they had made together for its expansion. As the years passed, he had opportunities to remarry. There were women in Rock Springs and neighboring communities who made their interest known, but he never did. "I had the great love of my life," he would say when asked. "Some men never find that once. I wouldn't dishonor it by seeking a pale imitation." When Michael married at 23, bringing his bride to live in a new house built on the ranch property, Caleb watched with quiet satisfaction as Ruth's legacy of wisdom and love continued into a new generation. And on quiet evenings, sitting in the rocking chair he had crafted for his elderly bride so many years before, he would remember her words and find peace in the knowledge that he had kept his promise. No regrets, only gratitude for the unexpected gift of a love that had defied convention and transformed both their lives. In the end, it was just as Ruth had said on that first journey to the ranch. Beauty and hardship often walk hand in hand. Their love had been beautiful precisely because it acknowledged life's hardships and transcended them, finding joy in shared purpose and mutual respect. A young cowboy had asked for wisdom, not beauty, and had been blessed beyond measure with both, in the form of a bride who arrived elderly and gray but whose spirit remained forever young.